can't figure it out. Do you want to be like me? Or you want to be me?
The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford is a 2007 film directed by Andrew Dominik. On the eve of what is meant to be the James gang's last robbery, Robert Ford, hired gun of minor importance, tries to ingratiate himself with Jesse James. As a youth, Ford put James on a pedestal. He believed the stories about James, the myths. After getting to know James, Ford comes to understand that the famous outlaw is only a man. He is not a god. He is not particularly clever or special. After a series of mishaps, misunderstandings, and deterioration of trust, Ford suspects that James will soon murder him. Believing that he is beating James to the punch, Ford shoots the legendary gunman from behind. In doing this, Ford achieves a level of notoriety that only James previously held. Ford becomes famous for this one act, but over time it wears on him. The guilt of the murder and the infamous nature of his fame. In the film, we encounter myths. When Ford brings up what he has read of James as a youth, the outlaw says that it's all lies. There is talk of the difference between what we are told to believe and what is true. It comes up many times in the film. Even the cinematography reflects this, as some scenes are shot with a purposeful flaw in the lenses, obscuring the truth. But all this talk of myth and the inability to discern fact from fiction is not only commentary on one man, it is broader. It is the stuff of all legends, the stuff of the Western, the stuff of America. From an industry standpoint, there are many theories about why the Western film genre fell out of favor with the American viewing public. Everything from oversaturation to the introduction of satire that challenged its mystique. But from a cultural perspective, one might claim that the American public could no longer accept the lies of the tropes attached to the Western. The frequent enemies being Native Americans, sometimes portrayed savagely and without empathy. The romanticization of westward expansion. The historical westward expansion of the United States of America created a view of what a man should be and how he relates to his country, his world, and his fellow man. A man is self-reliant, he is an outsider, and therefore a hero of his own story. He defends others, and more importantly himself, with a gun. He prefers the country to the city. He is a rugged individual who does not discuss his feelings. These myths were popularized in books about Western outlaws that deified men and rewrote their history to something more appealing to the customer, and these myths eventually became further cemented in the American consciousness by the motion picture industry and the Western film genre. This image of men, their women, and their guns has had a lasting effect on American culture and sociological development. In addition to much of it being false, its falsehoods were about a particular region of a country at a unique stage of economic, social, and technological development, which ceased to exist over a century ago. Now, by myths, I'm not referring to things like how the look of a Western town was popularized by Western films and may not have been accurate, or whether or not wearing that classic hat was as common as one might think. No, that's trivia at best. I mean cultural myths. The myths that still shape American values and sociological interaction to this day. The Western genre in both literature and film helped solidify the American Adam myth. An Adam myth is a concept of an ideal man based on shared cultural values. The American Adam is intelligent but not book smart. Street smart. He is experienced in the ways of the land instead. The American Adam is beloved by women, has disdain for authority, is physically fit, and quite frankly, the American Adam is portrayed as white. Jesse James is mythologized in literature as all of these things, but the reality is less heroic and fascinating. In the film, James's intelligence is unspectacular. He has a wife and is never shown cavorting with other women. He is physically fit until he becomes sick, and his disdain for authority has more to do with robberies than any ideology. The American Adam, this cultural figurehead, is used in everything from advertising to the cultivation of a political persona. George W. Bush did better with his constituents when he made himself out to be a cowboy, an American Adam, rather than what he was, a man born into wealth and privilege from Connecticut, not Texas. The American Dream. The classic rags-to-riches myth that declares Americans need only work hard and success will naturally come their way. It's a myth that motivates people to not only seek prosperity but gives the impression that prosperity is inevitable. Ronald Wright once said, "Socialism never took root in America because the poor see themselves not as an exploited proletariat but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires." The American dream mythologizes egalitarianism, as if the social and economic situation upon which one is born never has anything to do with one's success. Generational wealth is ignored in favor of this pleasant fantasy. The individualistic Western hero propagates this concept and the Western genre with its frontier spirit. It ennobles this attitude. Everyone in the West is self-made, self-reliant, abandoning the East Coast intellectualism for something rugged and untamed that they can cultivate for themselves. The Assassination of Jesse James, on the other hand, strips the outlaw of the romanticism of how he makes a living. The myth that James robbed from the rich and gave to the poor is dissected in the film. It's bogus, and the myth that James only robbed from those who he deemed tyrants due to their involvement in the Union side of the Civil War is debunked. The gives to the poor nonsense is dismantled in this scene when a musician makes obvious mistakes in his song and James's supposed politics are shot down, in this scene, in explicit language. The myth of male camaraderie. In a Western, the American Adam prefers the company of his male companions. They are men of the land and have an instant connection with each other, a bond. This suggests that men are happier and more fulfilled when in the presence of other men rather than women. This is mythologized in everything from sports to the fetishization of the military. In this film, the myth is eroded. The camaraderie of men is fraught with envy, betrayal, and insults to anyone who does not measure up under the aforementioned mythologized values. The Edenic myth. In a Western, nature is the ideal, and the desire to find Eden informs American westward expansion. Many Westerns are set in a romanticized Western region. In this film, however, the West is cold and remote. Men are seen living alone or riding through darkness, and in reality, westward expansion was political and violent, not romantic. Westerns often portray Native Americans as savages, in contrast to the civilized whites. The Assassination of Jesse James is remarkable in its exclusion of this genre trope, which appears to be intentional. The American Adam, instead, is portrayed as someone who obeys the laws of the land, of nature, rather than the laws of man, but in the film we see a perversion of this. The outlaw is not romanticized. The beginning of the train robbery is gorgeous and shows us contrast and spectacle, but once it begins, it is ugly, dangerous, and mean-spirited. Men who are just doing their jobs are brutalized. Jesse James tells someone to never tell him what he can and cannot do. This has nothing to do with obeying natural law. It has everything to do with his pride, selfishness, and self-centered attitude. Westerns could not hold on to these myths forever. Michael Agresta, writer for The Atlantic, once wrote of modern Westerns, "It's the task of Westerns to address that history, even as decade by decade that history becomes more and more embarrassing to us. In theory it's a beautiful thing, though in practice it means cowboy movies are easy to bungle because now they all take place on contested ground. Every Western must find its own way to reconcile itself to the founding contradictions of America." When Robert Ford idealizes Jesse James, Ford becomes the American public, and James becomes the American myth. Even after James tells Ford that everything said about him in the books is a lie, Ford still holds on to these myths. He still idealizes James. He still sees James as a larger-than-life figure. He believes the lie, even after knowing it is a lie, because it's simple, and simple lies are more digestible than complicated, harsh truths. Westerns sometimes operate in simplicity. White hats and black hats, good guys and bad guys. This is another way that this film subverts this expectation. as no character is fully good or evil. Throughout the film, Ford wants James to validate his life. He has been put upon by his brothers and other people who pick on him and treat him like dirt, and if only James, this mythical man, could give him that validation, maybe his suffering might be worth something. That's the American dream, isn't it? We suffer under those with more political and social power, and we tell ourselves that this suffering is building to something else. Our big break. The time when we are no longer the temporarily embarrassed millionaires, but simply millionaires. But these myths, much like James, are not only false, but dangerous. James never validates Ford's existence. He never makes him feel important, and generally speaking, that is true of most. The American dream is not fulfilled but for a few. Eventually, Ford believes James, the lie, the myth, is dangerous and needs to be put down, but Ford does not grow from this encounter the way one would hope the American public would if they were to finally discard the myths of the Old West, the myths about American exceptionalism, the myths about what makes a person worthwhile. James's myth, in death, only grows because what he represents, much like our American myths, is bigger than one man. This eats away at Ford. Maybe his ignorance was bliss. Hi everyone, if you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also the only way to request an episode. Also, please like, share, subscribe, and click on the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. I'll see you next week.